Good morning, Wendy, and welcome to your second part of the fascinating history of China and the rise of the Middle Kingdom.
Yes, yes.
You couldn't
So,
have imagined when you planned to do this just how incredibly topical it was going to be, would you?
no, you wouldn't unless you have some knowledge of it. It's interesting that this week there have been a couple of references to the century of humiliation, people just discussing China. It comes up again and again. So I'm hoping that you brought away with you from last week the idea of the Middle Kingdom, the knowledge that the Chinese really mean the Middle Kingdom, and the knowledge of that century of humiliation, because they are two of the things that most shape Chinese thinking even now. Now I'm going to try to go over to PowerPoint and see what we can do. So I'm going to share screen and hopefully I'll have it up in a short time. Oh, it says host has disabled screen sharing.
Which she hasn't, but I'll see what I can do. No, I certainly haven't. So I'm going to have to look at the settings on this. The Zoom keeps changing its settings, which makes it very difficult to keep up with it. I apologise all. I cannot find how to do that. Hang on, here we go. Allow participants to share screen. That should have happened now, Wendy.
Right, well, let's try now. Yes, we're right.
Brilliant.
Right, have we got screen sharing going?
We do.
Right. So this morning we are looking at the revolution between 1949 and 2020, which is a very big ask, and once again it's going to be really a lightning pass through Chinese history, so we will see how we go with this. Here's an overview of it. From 49 to 56, you see the revolution's settling in, but they're also fighting the Korean War at that stage. You might remember that Douglas MacArthur was very keen to turn that into a major war with China and finished up being dismissed. Mao is the only Chinese leader who is prone to what we call thought bubbles. So you can never quite predict what Mao was likely to come up with. In 1956, he thought it would be a good idea if people were allowed to criticise, or he said he did. And so we have this campaign called Let 100 Flowers Bloom, and they did, but the critics were saying all the wrong things, so Deng Xiaoping was ordered to suppress that. So the 100 Flowers had their heads cut off pretty promptly, and that one was left behind. It did expose a few enemies of the revolution, but it basically made very little impact. 1958 to 62 is the period of the Great Leap Forward, and I think many of you might remember vaguely things about that. You might remember, and it was an absolute disaster. This was catastrophe on a gigantic scale. In 1966, we come to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Now, again, you may remember people flashing around the little red book and people in dunces' hats. It took the West a long time to make any sense of the Cultural Revolution. And from 1976 to 92, we see Deng Xiaoping come to power and China rejoined the world. We all owe a great deal to Deng Xiaoping in the sense that we have all benefited from what he did. And we'll then skip over two who are virtually seen as caretaker presidents, I think, until we come to the current president, Xi Jinping, who is pretty much a mysterious proposition, and where he's going, we can't be entirely sure. So we'll start from there and look at the Mao years. You'll remember last week, we left revolution where they had just taken over and Mao had proclaimed the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square. The revolution began, on the whole, fairly moderately. And if you look at China's flag, its original explanation was the big star represents the CCP, and the smaller stars represent the four revolutionary classes. And those classes included the bourgeoisie. Now, if you know Marxism, you will know that the bourgeoisie are seen as an anti-revolutionary class, but this could be admitted given that we were at an early stage in the revolution. So it began on a fairly moderate level, doing essential things, except for the process of collectivization on the land, where they began to use a technique with which we are now very familiar in China, where you allow the people to express their grievances in very unpleasant ways. And that process of collectivization on the land was pretty savage. And many landlords died, suffered from the hostility of the parents in a method that the Chinese know as speak bitterness. It means you get all a man's enemies together and you just let them go at him. And sometimes he survived and sometimes he didn't. Interestingly, my lecturer at the University of Tasmania when I was working there was from that landlord class and had been affected by these speak bitterness campaigns. Even more interesting, even with that background, this lecturer was and could take pride in China's achievements despite the losses to his family. I think to have lost. By 1956, Mao was not satisfied with the pace of progress, so in 1958, he announced the Great Leap Forward. This picture shows you the ideas behind the Great Leap Forward. If you look at the man in overalls, he represents the factory workers. The woman behind him, I think, is a peasant. The one behind is a member of the Communist Party. The lady behind that, I think, might represent students, and there's the army, and they're all working together to produce vast prosperity, and China is moving into what is obviously a paradise. So this was the idea behind the Great Leap Forward. Collectivization on the land had begun with things like mutual aid teams, small teams sharing their land, sharing their tractors. But with the Great Leap Forward, this was going to go to a whole new scale with communes of 10,000 people and more, tens of thousands of people, some of them up to 60,000. They were not going to have family meals anymore. There were going to be collective kitchens. Children would be collectively raised. We were just going to take a huge jump into communism. the Soviet Union was looking on all this askance, and I'll have a little bit more to say about the Soviet Union later on, but in the backs of your heads, you need to know that China's relationship with the Soviet Union was always a love-hate one. Yes, they were both socialist states, but again, you might remember from your youth, they're very much in the habit of hurling insults at each other because of some kind of deviation from the communist ideology. They were never totally in agreement, and that has reached the level of open hostility from time to time. The idea behind this was that agriculture was going to become way more productive, and it was going to pay for a very rapid industrialisation. So very ambitious targets were set for agriculture. The communes rivaled each other in announcing their targets. So if the commune next to you was going to do this, then you were going to produce way more. Those targets were often desperately unrealistic. And Reese, you wanted to say something? You're muted. Did you have that? Did you?
Sorry, apologies. I was only waving to our latest people who had just...
Oh, right. Steel making was encouraged as a patriotic act through China. They were hoping to surpass Great Britain's steel and iron production in the space of the Great Leap Forward, so they were going to go ahead there. And so people were encouraged to build little blast furnaces in their backyard and to put all the cooking utensils and anything else that was metal into those so that they could turn it into steel. And tools, everything went into these furnaces. So you did your day in the fields and came home and did a bit of blast furnacing to create some steel in the patriotic cause. The Great Leap Forward was a catastrophic disaster. The figures are still being discussed. A historian called Frank Dicotta has come up with the latest estimates. I think the most recent one is they think 45 million people died in the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward. The stories that come out of it are horrendous. The government took large parts of the harvests, and the peasantry were left quite simply without enough to eat. It was catastrophic. It was apparent that it was catastrophic from as early as 1959. Mao reportedly said it's better that half the people die if the other half can have full stomachs. So he was less concerned. Within the party, there were people who spoke out. And there's one in particular, I think it probably pays to know. There's one, you will find a great deal on the net about the famine. If you look it up, you will find plenty of pictorial evidence. Peng Dehuai was the commander. He was a soldier who had been with the revolution from the beginning. He'd been on the Long March, and his relationship with Mao was such that Mao was a late sleeper. Peng Dehuai wasn't. And when Peng Dehuai wished to speak to Mao, he would come in and rip the covers off and, let's get going. He had not been ever disloyal, but he spoke out openly on the policy and on what was happening. He was promptly dismissed from his place as Minister for Defence, and he was replaced by Lin Biao, who was a Mao loyalist. Among the other critics, the quieter critics who didn't speak out too boldly, but certainly made their views known, were Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Liu Shaoqi was a conservative communist. He was a planner, very meticulous individual. He was number 2 in the party after Mao. I can't remember where Deng Xiaoping ranked at that stage. I think around about 7th. Those two began fairly quietly to modify economic policy to try to redeem the situation. And the Great Leap finally ended in 1962. 3 years of pure hell. Mao retired for a time. He seemed to be pretty much in eclipse. He complained about being treated like an ancestor, revered but ignored, and it's a feeling I can sometimes go along with in my own household. Revered but ignored seems to work fairly well. But these people had been noted in Mao's head. And then this happened. And you may well remember this. I don't know if you recall at all Mao swimming in the Yangtze. This was July 16th, 1966, when the chairman went for a swim, cheered on by people, and the Red Army went for a swim bearing banners, and it all looked pretty comical. And at the same time, this sort of stuff was going on. We saw students assembling in Red Square. Now, you will, you will, I think, remember people waving the little red book around. A lot of people owned the little red book. It was quite freely available in this country. Everybody was familiar with the little red book and the sayings of Mao. And we knew that these big rallies were happening in Tiananmen Square. We knew that there were kids, and we saw odd pictures like this, people wearing these huge dunces caps. The West really just had no idea of what was going on. But this, you see happening in these photographs, this was termed struggle. And what was happening was this. By mid-June 1966, Mao was urging young people in the party to attack counter-revolutionary forces within the party, as well as what he termed the 4 olds: old culture, old customs, old ideas, and old habits. He reminded the young people of China that a revolution was violent. I don't know if you've ever come across Mao's saying a revolution is not a dinner party. And he talked about the need for violence. Now, this was a generation who had been raised on Mao, on reverence for Mao. And Mao was urging them to be wild, to attack. And it meant attack your teachers, attack your grandparents, attack whatever was old. And students in their millions took this on board. It's as if we set the young people in our society on fire and said to them, go out there, get rid of what's old. You are making the revolution. You are making China's future. And left them with it. Don't like a teacher? Get him. And really get him. So teachers were hauled out of their classrooms. They were made to stand in front of their students. Students were free to hit those teachers, to spit on them, whatever. Many died as a result of the beatings. Many died. Many more committed suicide. I think it's in Shanghai. They were talking about fishing the corpses out of the river every morning and lining them up on the banks of the river. Schools and universities were suspended as the students ran riot. They made free travel available to Beijing so that you could go and do a bit of Mao adulation. The suffering was enormous. When it comes to thinking about what shapes China's leaders, the Cultural Revolution can't, I think, be overestimated. It got to the point where it was literally threatening civil war. Now, among those who suffered were Liu Shaoqi, China's head of state for 10 years, Peng Dehuai, who was old, suffered. These people were imprisoned, they were tortured, they were stripped, they were humiliated. Along with him, Zhu De, the most respected of all Chinese commanders, was submitted to this whole struggle process. Deng Xiaoping was sent down for 4 years. Being sent down means that you were sent out to the countryside. So Deng Xiaoping wound up where he'd been a long time before, working in a tractor factory. His brother died in the Cultural Revolution. His son was either driven to jump from a window or was thrown, but whatever way, his son wound up as a paraplegic, and Deng and his wife were trying to look after this son on very minimal income for that period of 4 years. The current Prime Minister, the current President of China, Xi Jinping, lost his elder sister when Red Guards went through the house. He saw his father endure struggle. He saw his mother forced to denounce his father, and he himself was sent down to Shanxi to work as an agricultural labourer to learn from the peasants. The nightmare that haunts China's leaders is the threat of chaos, turmoil, that China will break apart. It's been what happened between dynasties for 2 millennia. It is an ever-present threat. When Chinese leaders start talking about turmoil and chaos, all the red lights are flashing, because the current Chinese leadership will do whatever is necessary. If they think China is threatened with chaos, they will take whatever action they have to. By 1967, the Red Guards were turning on each other in the cities, and the army under Lin Biao became involved in restoring order. China was still run by Red Guards, and that went on until Mao died in 1976. The Cultural Revolution really only came to an end in 1976, though its first viciousness was tempered a bit. Nevertheless, there was an element of military rule. And when in 1968 Mao ordered the students to go down to the countryside to learn from the peasants, there was huge relief among the leadership when the students actually obeyed. The threat of major disorder was averted. but it has never been forgotten. It is still there. China officially recalls the Cultural Revolution as a great event. Mao even dying, Mao considered this one of his great achievements. He had revitalised the revolution. The party did finally condemn the Cultural Revolution unequivocally in 1981, and it restored the reputations of the victims of the Cultural Revolution. Liu Shaoqi was no longer seen as the traitor that he had been, so his honours were restored. But since Liu had died, an apology seems pretty much inadequate, and I don't think they quite apologised anyway. And now we come to Deng Xiaoping. I think I said last week, you know, I can empathise with most European leaders. I really find these people very difficult to empathise with. Deng's daughter said he never spoke a word against Mao. And I think, how is that possible? When he had his paraplegic son to remind him of the costs, when his brother had died in the Cultural Revolution, how does this man keep saying the words that keep him loyal to Mao? If I could have someone at a dinner party and talk to them about what really happened, I think I'd probably be willing to do a deal with the devil to make that person Deng Xiaoping, because I think he is one of the most interesting people really ever. He's a great survivor. He had gone to France at 20. I think he went to France at 20 to study. His family was very committed to his education. Like Mao, he came from a family that was not wealthy, but prosperous enough to be able to afford to send him to France, with help from a scholarship organisation, which promptly failed when he got there. So at 20, Deng Xiaoping, who was a very little man, and the reason I showed you, there's a photograph there of Deng with Jimmy Carter and his wife. Deng's 4'11", if you remember the old measurements, about 1.5 metres tall. Nobody who met him, it fails to be impressed. Deng was extraordinarily knowledgeable, totally a doer. Something special certainly existed so far as Mao was concerned. He seems to have enjoyed some special status with Mao, even though he fell in and out of favour more than once. Deng was pretty quick to come up with what is known in China as self-criticism, where you get up and say, I've made terrible errors, you know, I've been a rightist, deviationist, or one of those Marxist terms, you know, I've wandered into misunderstanding of the doctrines. And Deng was very quick to do that as required. So he steered his course all the way through. I always find it odd. Liu Shaoqi was tortured and died, as I will show you. Sorry, I haven't done my switch over. How many of you, I'll just look to gallery view for a moment. I don't think I've got the whole one. No, I can't get it. Okay. Let's go. Let's just go back.
You'll have to stop sharing before you can get the full gallery view, Wendy.
Right, okay. How many of you had a chance to look at any of those clips that I suggested for you? Good, for those of you who did. But for the moment, we will share, and I will show you what happened to Liu Shaoqi.
Are you screen sharing again?
I'm just going to go to screen sharing again. I'm just finding my place and hoping that it will work from there.
Good.
To be active in making revolution. We felt this was revolution.
You can't see it.
Now I've just got to get it up again.
A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not as inter-party. We had to be rough and harsh and wild.
In my class, there was a student whose grandfather had owned a big fabric store, so he was a capitalist. I heard that everyone was to go to their house to criticize him.
Sorry that
I got there late, and by the time I arrived, the capitalist had been beaten to death. I remember that his head was all swollen and dark and bruised. I didn't look for long, and then we all left. But later I learned that this capitalist was killed after my classmates got there. Other students and probably Red Guards from the neighborhood also got involved.
I'm just looking for my meeting again. That's the one I can't. I'll just stop share again and go to share screen. This is my absolute nightmare. Am I sharing yet?
No, you're not. You were sharing. Now you're sharing again. Yes. Yep. Now we've got your
Right. Got it now?
Yes.
I didn't look for long, and then we all left.
We will just go back a little.
Soon he died. The people we beat up were all hooligans and loose women whose names were given to us by the workers. I put them on a truck and told them to kneel down. I whipped them with a leather belt. There were men and women. Most were women. We beat them hard. I had a kind of animal instinct. I used to enjoy beating people. I didn't know most of the people who were struggled against. When we heard different views, we wondered, if you sympathized with the party official, did it mean you were too simplistic? Did it mean you lacked political consciousness and couldn't see his evil capitalist voter nature? Whenever a question came up, our first reaction was not to believe the official might be innocent, but that we were too naive and too inexperienced. I didn't think about it much. Chairman Mao called on us to be involved with affairs of state, to be active in making revolution. We felt this was revolution. Chairman Mao had said, a revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. It's not as inter-party. We had to be rough and harsh and wild.
In my class, there was a student whose grandfather had owned a big fabric store, so he was a capitalist. I heard that everyone was to go to their house to criticize him. I got there late, and by the time I arrived, the capitalist had been beaten to death. I remember that his head was all swollen and dark and bruised. I didn't look for long, and then we all left. But later I learned that this capitalist was killed after my classmates got there. Other students and probably Red Guards from the neighborhood also got involved. All those people beat him to death, including his own granddaughter, my classmate. I didn't think much about it then because this kind of thing happened a lot. But years later, I thought about it many times and I wanted to find an answer. The question was very difficult. It was, if I had not arrived late, what would I have done? Would I have beaten him? He was a capitalist, but at the same time, he was a man, an old man. I have never been able to answer this question.
By 1967, the radical Cultural Revolution group dominated the government. Members included Lin Biao and Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. She often appeared as Mao's spokesperson and had gained great power. Her calls for violent struggle were immediately obeyed by millions of Red Guards. Moderate leaders, repulsed by the fanaticism, felt closer to Zhou Enlai. Zhou's role in the Cultural Revolution is ambiguous. He tried to moderate events, but in the end, he always sided with Mao. He tried to protect people, but his power had limits. Many close to him would soon be brutally attacked. People from the Cultural Revolution group told us to drag out Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and overthrow them. Crowds of people filled the street. Loudspeakers were blasting towards Zhongnan High. Will be handed over to be struggled against. It was very revolutionary, very fashionable to drag him out. Zhou tried to send the students away. He warned Liu and his wife, Wang Guangmei, to stay inside the leader's compound at Zhongnan High. In April 1967, Red Guards tricked Wang into leaving, saying one of her daughters had had an accident. They dragged her in front of this crowd. They dressed her as a whore and repeatedly humiliated her. Later, Wang Guangmei was jailed. She spent 12 years in solitary confinement. Deng Xiaoping was struggled against and exiled to a remote village. Liu Shaoqi was attacked and beaten. He was kept under house arrest for 2 years. Then, weakened by torture and cancer, no longer able to eat, speak, or use his hands, he was wrapped in a sheet and flown to this remote prison. Weeks later, Liu Shaoqi, China's head of state for 10 years, died, naked and alone. In 1967, the Cultural Revolution entered a new stage, factional warfare. The Red Guards had never been a unified movement.
Wow.
At first, only students with good communist backgrounds were admitted. The millions of young people left out.
That was the Cultural Revolution. And you can see why it became so frightening. In a similar situation, none of us could count ourselves safe. And it was brutal and frightening beyond belief. In deaths, in terms of deaths, nothing like as expensive as the Great Famine, but an experience of anarchy that no one in China wants to experience again. So that's why it becomes such a scarring thing. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So Deng got through these years, and as I said, his daughter said he never had a word to say against Mao. He was recalled from Jiangxi province in 1973, but by this stage, savage factional fighting was going on within the leadership group as Mao entered into decline and was to die in 1976. Deng was actually recalled to power in 1975, but at the time of Mao's death, he was out of power again. I think he loathed Jiang Qing, who was a very unpleasant piece of work. If you saw the clip that I suggested on Deng Xiaoping, you would have heard that she launched a ship and was rejoicing in this ship. And Deng said publicly, which cannot have endeared him to her, he said, "I travelled on a ship like that when I was 20. So having made clear that she didn't know what progress was about, he was certainly tabbed. Had Jiang Qing prevailed, I think Deng wouldn't have lasted long, but somehow he managed to make it through that. He actually managed to outmaneuver the Gang of Four who looked to succeed Mao. With the support they thought they were Mao's heirs, but in fact they were outmaneuvered by Deng, and he began very quickly. Even before Mao died, he had begun talking about the four modernizations: agriculture, defense, industry, science and technology. He was beginning with household responsibility in agriculture. I think I have to go back one. He was totally the pragmatist, and somewhere I have some lovely slides on here. Which...
You're not sharing at the moment, Wendy.
Oh, right, okay, I'll come back. Right, I'll go back to screen sharing. I am apologising, I'm not doing as well on my technology this week.
Doing all right.
Right, now we'll go back to it. Now we're right?
Yep.
Right. So there is Deng Xiaoping in his many manifestations. The cowboy hat was given to him when he visited the United States in 1979. He really was a soldier. He had been a soldier through the revolution, among other things. And these are the sorts of things Deng said, which does rather endear one to him. Right back in 1962, he had originally said some version of this and then pulled it out of the speech, deciding that the times were not right for it. But Deng is very famous for having said, "Black cat or white cat, if it can catch mice, it's a good cat." Deng was not into ideology. He really didn't care. He was a man who wanted to get things done. He talked about crossing the river by feeling each stone. In other words, what he was saying is, we can't be sure of how we're going, but as you go through a river that you don't know, feeling for the stones and making sure that you've got something under your feet, that was Deng's technique for revolution in China. We will make mistakes, and he freely admitted to mistakes, always making those, making clear his own responsibility in those. He fell in and out of favour, as we've said, but this was his program. So we see these four modernisations. We see household responsibility in agriculture. Deng was a great thinker. He was somebody who acted. He was very decisive in decision-making. According to the American scholar who was his biographer, he was a decision maker. It was interesting, I was looking at video clips of Americans who actually dealt with Deng or were flies on the wall at some of the diplomatic conferences that went on as China was opening up. Now, obviously, there were all sorts of difficulties here. They liked dealing with Deng. They described him as the least Chinese of Chinese leaders, in the sense that there was no, I'm trying to think of a better word, but basically Deng was a noble-ship man. He was not interested in circumlocution. He came straight to the point. Even on big issues like Taiwan, Deng was able to say, all right, well, we'll recognise your commitment to Taiwan so long as you recognise that Taiwan is essentially a part of China. And ditto with Margaret Thatcher dealing with Hong Kong. It was Deng who came up with the one country, two systems solution that is so much under threat at the moment. He was very swift on the action front. He was fascinated by technology. He was a very clear thinker, and he viewed creating prosperity as being the key to China's stability. He laid the foundations with his new economic policies. He laid the foundations for China to really move into the prosperity of today. I left a little bit off that. He followed the Taiwanese model in setting up special economic zones. And it's really here that breathless rise that we see has its foundations. Deng wasn't going to see the staggering growth rates of the early second millennium, but he certainly began it. He set up, for instance, I suppose the best example of one of these special economic zones is Shenzhen, which is a Chinese city set up near Guangzhou, which was the old canton. That city was what the Chinese termed a fishing village on 30,000 people back in 1979. It currently is something like 13, 14 million in that space of time. There was a great deal of discontent in China in the 1980s. They were coming about for a variety of reasons. There was inflation. There was a fair amount of corruption in the Communist Party itself. It is endemic, but the levels rise and fall. Students in the universities were being exposed to Western ideas. Students were returning from abroad. Many of them were beginning to think that the democratic ideas of the West were a great idea. And within the Communist Party itself, there were those who were toying with democratisation. So it was a bit of a simmering cauldron. If you set out on an economic program like the one China was embarking on, you are going to have all sorts of problems. When we just look at the figures, it just looks like a steady rise. But when you're actually, if you're actually there, what you are seeing are the gross inequalities that were occurring, seeing the corruption. So there was a great deal of discontent. You will remember I was planning a trip to China in 1989, and major sort of things were bubbling away, and I deferred it. I think I was thinking of going around about September. And the students were assembling in Tiananmen Square, and it all started pretty innocuously. I must admit, I started to have a few reservations. If you recall those demonstrations at all, you will remember the image of a kind of Statue of Liberty that they put up in the square, and I thought, you know, they really are getting onto dodgy ground now. Deng Xiaoping had shown himself hostile to democracy. He was a believer in discipline. And as you can see from his daughter's comment, he himself submitted to party discipline as he needed to. He was not a man to tolerate democracy lightly, but nor was he absolutely opposed to it. That disorder, though, was becoming painfully reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. When Deng was asked about what the worst period of his life was, he said it was the Cultural Revolution. I suspect the Tiananmen Square massacres were one of the most difficult decisions of his life. I don't think he took that just, oh, the students are misbehaving, so we will call the army. I think it was a difficult decision. I don't think he was the kind of individual who looked back and lost himself in guilt, but nevertheless, it was done, and a group of elders, no longer officially in power, but they ordered the troops in, and the massacres took place, as we all know. It's a bit unfortunate that Deng is known mainly in the West as the perpetrator of the Tiananmen Square massacres, because he was, in fact, a way more creative individual than that. I don't know whether I have time for... Yes, I have time for this little story. When I'm doing this history, I come into... There's some very dodgy evidence. Once you start doing Chinese history, you will very quickly become aware that the books are very biased. Americans have their own viewpoint on Chinese history. America still mourns the loss of China, which has prompted a lot of historians from other places to say, why did they ever think it was theirs to lose in the first place? So there has always been this melancholy note that in some way the Chinese failed American expectations, and that certainly exists at the moment. Deng himself, here's the thin evidence that I come to rely on. Deng was apparently sitting next to Shirley MacLaine at a dinner, and she told Deng the story of a doctor. I don't know whether there was an interpreter here. I assume there was. I don't think Shirley MacLaine actually speaks Chinese. But she told him the story of a doctor who had been sent down during the Cultural Revolution and came back a better communist and more committed to the communist cause and feeling himself improved by the whole experience. Now, apparently Deng's comment on that, if we can believe Shirley MacLaine as an historical source, Deng said he lied. So he was summing up he obviously gave a bit of his own experience there. He clearly didn't feel he'd been made a better communist by the Cultural Revolution. But he did make a very important decision. When they tried Jiang Qing, that was as close as they were ever going to come to trying Mao. Deng very clearly saw Mao as the embodiment of the Chinese Revolution. To have allowed Mao's name to be besmirched, as for instance Joseph Stalin was by Khrushchev in 1956, was to Deng unthinkable. Once again, the pragmatists took over. Deng chose in no way to diminish the legend of Mao. The Chinese Communist Party's official position on Mao is a surprisingly precise one. Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. I don't know how you arrive at a conclusion as precise as that, but that has been the official position. Mao's mistakes have been admitted, but the cult of Mao is alive and well, and Mao occupies this mythical status. As you know, his portrait is still over Tiananmen Square. He is still the revered symbol of the Chinese Revolution. What Deng's personal opinions were, we will never know. That's why I would love to get him at a dinner party and say, come on, tell me really how you feel about Mao. Because I think he would have, if he had ever been totally honest with us, I suspect the loyal servant of Mao had some very independent views. Mao respected his intelligence so much so that when he was sent down to Jiangxi province during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping was guarded by somebody. Now, we don't know who gave those orders. It might have been Zhou Enlai, but the fact that Mao himself recalled Deng suggests that Mao did not wish to see Deng go the way of Liu Shaoqi. And here are China's GDP figures. Deng was never going to see, as you can see from that graph, Deng is not going to see the fruit of what he was doing. But certainly China became way more prosperous in his time than it had ever been before. Chinese were beginning to have TV sets, they were beginning to have new clothes, they were out of the Mao suits and the women were into high heels and handbags and all the stuff. So it was all happening then, and that bothered Zhang. He didn't like the Western materialism that he saw creeping in, even though he was the man who said that it was a good thing, that poverty was not socialism, that it was great to be rich and a patriotic duty if you could be rich. So he was a bit uneasy about it. But when you look at these figures from 2000 onwards, it was not Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao who created that. It was Deng, and that's the prosperity that has financed this country for the last 20 years. This is the wave that we have been riding, and it was created by Deng Xiaoping back in the 1970s. If you're more expert than I am on economics, you can challenge on that. And now, Hu Jintao and Zhang Jiang were pretty much caretakers. They did a competent job, but there was no great brilliant flair in either of them. One of them was quite a good singer, I think, and rather liked Western music. and one of them, I think, was Jiang Zemin, who spoke English quite well. But this is the man who is currently at the helm of China. I don't know whether his position has been severely weakened by the COVID virus, but he is a fascinating character. Again, like Deng, he suffered from the Cultural Revolution. He is what is called a princeling. Now, someone last week asked a question about princelings, which tells me that at least one of you knows what that term means. It means basically the children of the leaders of the revolution. They have been an enormously privileged bunch in Chinese history. They have lived as a kind of aristocracy in China. The princelings are generally extremely wealthy. Patronage gives them high positions almost by right. Deng Xiaoping's children, though Deng himself showed no particular preference for anything very lush, except French wine and croissants. He was rather devoted to French culture, and he did speak French because of his years in France as a young man, and chose Giscard d'Estaing to tell some interesting things to. He spoke very comfortably with Giscard d'Estaing. But this one is a thinker. There are interesting signs of humanity in this man, and we did see that when he came to Tasmania. I don't know if you remember Deng Xiaoping visiting Tasmania, but we actually should. He would, a class of students from one of the Launceston schools wrote to him and said, "You should come to Tasmania." And he did. And he came and he quoted that letter. Not only did he quote that letter, but when he was here, knowing, because this is a man who does not do, I think, anything without thinking about it. We are never going to get a thought bubble from him. He thinks through what he's doing. But he chose as a vice premier of China, and his visit, or was he, I think he'd actually taken over as president. And he spoke of the Terhune Air Walk and a couple of other Tasmanian tourist attractions. And this is a man who knew perfectly well that this would be a major help to Tasmanian tourism. So if you have benefited in any way from the many Chinese tourists who have come, Xi Jinping, for a time, was a pretty dazzling tourist promoter for Tasmania. He only needed to say a few words and we were guaranteed a Chinese tourist boom. He would have known that. As a young man, he had spent 2 weeks in Idaho, in the United States, studying agriculture as a young official. He stayed with a family there. When he visited the United States, he visited with that family, took the trouble. Now, again, he does nothing without thinking about it. So there's no question that these things are going to promote goodwill. And he was happy to do that. But there's also a little touch in there of humanity that is really quite interesting. He did have a connection with Jim Bacon, and he did meet, when he came to Tasmania, with Jim Bacon's family and commiserated with him on Jim Bacon's death, because he had died by the time he came. And yet this is the man we are being told wants to be a new Mao. I have reservations about that. Well, I'll show you how he. And there he is with the French president. I think, again, the sign of the thinker is there. Madame Xi. I suspect there was a checklist involved. His first marriage didn't work out, but in 1997 he married this lady, Peng Liyuan, who was at the time more famous than he was. She is a Chinese folk singer. As you can see, she looks good in a way that Deng Xiaoping's wife did not. She speaks some English. She holds the rank, I think, of Major General in the Chinese army because of her folk singing. I think she basically ticked all the boxes, and put it this way, I think practicality came into it as much as passion. I think this is a man who makes a list and knows what he wants to do. These pictures, I think you will find very interesting. I don't know if any of you can explain what they're doing here. Winnie the Pooh is banned on the Chinese internet. The Chinese, as you know, are very clever with technology. And this Disney Winnie the Pooh, I might add, I don't know whether the Chinese know about the shepherd Winnie the Pooh, but the Disney Winnie the Pooh does bear a passing resemblance to Xi Jinping. And so the Chinese took to showing pictures of Winnie the Pooh wearing a crown and other such insulting suggestions. And so Winnie the Pooh is now persona non grata on the Chinese internet. And he is heavily censored and becomes a villain. The second picture is a very interesting one because it might recall to you something we were talking about last week. These pictures are actually on the BBC website, and the BBC describes the handshake at the bottom as one of the most awkward handshakes in history. It's Shinzo Abe with Xi Jinping, and whenever Chinese and Japanese leaders meet, that's very likely to be the answer, to be the style, because between those two, there lies a big obstacle called the Nanjing Massacre. And there is a memory of the Nanjing Massacre for you. He and his family suffered during the Cultural Revolution. She, in fact, had a hard time being accepted into the Communist Party at all. I don't know if you're aware of this, but you don't join the Chinese Communist Party just on impulse. You don't say, I think I'll join the party and distribute a few leaflets and things like that. You have to be accepted. And only around 6.5% of the Chinese population are actually party members. The Communist Party constitutes itself a fairly elite organisation. She was sent down to Shanxi. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was 1967, if I recall correctly, but I could be a year or two out. He had to apply 7 times to be accepted as a member of the Communist Youth Organisation, which is not quite the Communist Party, and 10 times to get into the Communist Party itself. Now, the time in Shanxi has become a sort of part of the legend that surrounds Xi Jinping. So if you look on YouTube, you will find a million clips remembering the heroic things that Xi did in Shanxi, because it's now made very clear to the Chinese people that he was always a remarkable man. Up to a point, that's true, but there's been a fair amount of embroidery on it. This is what he has to say about his time in Shanxi. He's talking about hardship. Fat in January, thin in February, half dead in March and April. We say a sword is made on a grinding stone and a man is forged in hardship. So he's another of those who says he came back redder than red, that he had discovered communism. He was a better person for his experience in Shanxi. Now, there is a story on Wikipedia that at one stage he ran away from Shanxi, not liking the life in the village. I've only seen that story in Wikipedia. I can't find verification for it. So whether that is in fact true and there is a big blot on his career in Shanxi, I don't know. But it would certainly be fairly characteristic that if that story was true, it would be fairly well suppressed in China. And here again is a little insight into Xi Jinping's thinking. Around about 2012, and I think he was one of the vice premiers at the time, but he did lose it a bit with the Western press. And this is one of the very few times we see Xi Jinping express some of his frustration. He rather said, pretty snappily, there are some bored foreigners with full stomachs who have nothing better to do than point fingers at us. First, China doesn't export revolution. Second, China does not export hunger and poverty. Third, China doesn't come and cause you headaches. What more is there to be said? And I think that shows probably a fairly constant frustration with trying to interpret China in the West. He worked from 1969 to 74 as a labourer in a village in Shanxi. May or may not have run away for a time. There were projects that he did undertake there. But from 1975 to 79, he was free to study engineering. He spent 2 years in the army, but this was not the sort of army experience Deng Xiaoping had had. His father's eminent position, to which he'd been restored by that stage, meant that a friend of his father's took him on as a secretary. So he was operating more or less in a clerical role at a fairly high level in the army. Useful experience for any young man. I do hope you will watch the TED Talk that I suggested on the notes for this week. Eric Lee talking about Chinese government, because here is the kind of CV that a Chinese leader is likely to have. He had a very steady rise in the provincial administration. Now, his career by the late 90s, early 2000s was certainly blooming. He eventually became governor of the province of Fujian. If you are chairman of the provincial Communist Party, you are the head of government, whether you are called that or not. Now, Fujian has a population of 39 million people. So Xi Jinping was not a newcomer to government. We are not dealing with amateurs here. He had presided over Fujian at a time of very rapid growth, so he was very familiar with the whole growth process, the whole modernization process in China. He went from there to Zhejiang, a province with a population of 59 million, and from there to another of China's most important regions. He became party secretary of Shanghai after the previous one was prosecuted for corruption. Xi had already shown himself to be tough on corruption. And again, unusually for a politician, as he became vice president of China in 2008, his family went through a period of selling up some of their assets because all his family are enormously wealthy. Again, the family of a princeling. He became vice president in 2008. He became president again in 2012, in 2006, sorry, he became president in 2012 and again in 2016. And as we know, the limit on the presidential term was abolished in 2018. So he may well be there for life. We don't know. I know The Economist was heavily of the opinion that there was a new Mao in the offing. What we have certainly seen is, apart from that toughness on corruption, we have certainly seen a tightening of control within China and in the border territories. He has and certainly the chasing down of dissidents in Hong Kong has been fairly ruthless and has brought about the present crisis. And I think the warning signals are there on Hong Kong, because I think they are beginning to talk turmoil and chaos, and those are not good words when the Chinese leadership uses them. She talks about the China dream. The China dream is that of China as a developed nation, the eradication of absolute poverty, and very importantly in there, the restoration of China's proper position in the world. And we know what that is. China expects, I would like, very much from the rest of the world, respect. I did say last week, and I will hold on to that, China has never been a particularly aggressive power in the military sense. But it does view the South China Sea as its territory. Taiwan is territorially a part of China. It's never cut that tie. Hong Kong, I would have to point out, is also a part of China. Whether we like it or not, there is an agreement, the one country, two systems thing, that should go through to 2047. I think many people always doubted whether that was a possibility. And you really don't know where to stand on that. Your sympathy is with demonstrators, your sympathy is with the people of Hong Kong who have grown up in a state with Western freedoms, but who are faced with China demanding that Hong Kong return dissidents to China, to a fate that may not be pleasant. She also dreams the biggest infrastructure project in the history of mankind, the Belts and Roads Initiative. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but again, if you look it up on YouTube, you will be able to find programs of any length on it. You'll find a couple that will explain it in 3 or 4 minutes, and you will find plenty that deal with it in greater depths. Many of those are produced by television, controlled by the People's Republic, because China is very sophisticated in its use of media and very quick to put its own point of view, even through Western reporters, and did offer huge numbers of jobs to Western reporters. But this is a breathtakingly ambitious project. Here it is. The belts, interestingly enough, and rather confusingly, the railways, and I think belts also covers the high-tech infrastructure. But what China is looking to is linking up all those regions with high-speed rail and with high-speed internet, state-of-the-art internet. The roads are the sea routes, and as you know, Victoria has signed up to this on an independent basis, and currently is in trouble because Australia has not signed up to it. America views this with horror. I mean, it is at present a fairly vaguely shaped dream, not spelt out in huge detail. Something like 135 countries have some kind of agreement with China on the Belts and Roads project, saying they want to cooperate. But these agreements are sort of semi-binding, again, pretty ill-defined. But if that is not a dream of the return of the Middle Kingdom, I really don't know what is. Because you are looking, and the Chinese are very aware of this, you are looking at the revival of the Spice Road. And again, the Spice Road was at the heart of the Middle Kingdom's power. So we're seeing this dream of linking through to Europe, and Italy, I think, is signatory to the Belts and Roads project. Not sure whether Germany is or isn't, but the agreements are in place for this to happen. What effect COVID virus and the recession, there was certainly the back steps the world will have to take on the economic front will play in that, I really don't know. So whether it just remains a pipe dream. And this, of course, ties in with the whole Uyghur question, where, as you know, China's policies have been pretty horrible. But the territory of the Uyghurs is up here. The Uyghurs, and you will notice that this is a pretty key point in the Belts and Roads. And there is a history of terrorism in that region, nothing like as dramatic, for instance, as the Twin Towers, but there certainly has been terrorism. It's a Muslim area. China obviously has seen the Western experience, and when you look at Western responses to Islamic terrorism, ours are not always impeccable, but China's can only be described as brutal. But again, threat and order in China and the Chinese leaders will do what they see as necessary. So the Uyghurs again come into, I think, that category, a threat to order. So China today faces many, many problems. There are still inequalities. When we look at that, though, we have to remember that China has raised 500 billion people out of poverty. That is the equivalent of raising South America out of poverty, the whole of it. They dream that maybe they will be able to eradicate all poverty. And we have all benefited from the 30% of global growth that's been generated by China. So what I would like you to take away from it is this, to know that China has been, in its own eyes, for 2 millennia at least, the Middle Kingdom. I'd like you to remember that the century of humiliation is central to Chinese thinking. I would like you to remember that the nightmare for China's leaders is disorder and chaos. The Cultural Revolution demonstrated how real that nightmare might become. They saw themselves there as on a knife edge. It hasn't been forgotten. China has taken careful note of the fate of the USSR, and they see that as the price of weakness. So you are dealing with a nation whose leaders are going to do what they have to maintain order. They are absolutely convinced that China's future depends on the one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And when they see a threat to that, they will do whatever is necessary. One of the China historians finished a talk to people by quoting from Joseph Heller, Catch-22, and what he quoted was, "It's hopeless, relax." So there you are. There are my words to you. And I'll stop screen sharing now.
A good note to end on, Wendy. Now, I don't know if you can see the chat there, but down on your right-hand side, Sue's saying, I was told the workers had led an uprising in 1989 and were slaughtered before the students in Tiananmen Square, that the issue was workers' pay and living conditions. That was also rising as an issue recently with workers pressing for an increase in wages. That's happened to some extent. Can you confirm what I was told by the person who told me? He was the man who set up the Oslo Accord.
You are certainly, that is certainly right, because the students in Beijing were being supported by many people in Beijing. And that did include the workers, and there was discontent around workers' wages and conditions. As I said, there was simmering discontent through much of the late 80s, through much of the 1980s, and especially in the late 80s. So it wasn't just students. Students have a tradition of coming to these things and turning them into their own causes. But yes, it's perfectly true that the first people to suffer, and in fact, the majority who died, were probably the people of Beijing.
Now, everybody, please unmute yourselves if you like and join the conversation. But I gather, Fern and Rob, you still have trouble with sound. So there's another question. The use-by date of recent Chinese leaders is about 10 to 12 years. Who would replace Xi if he was removed?
That's something we don't know, because the real political process in China takes place pretty much among the 25 members of the Politburo and at the top of that, you have somewhere between 7 and 9 people who constitute an inner council. The workings of that group are opaque. I don't know how many people in the West actually have a real handle on what goes on within that group. So we don't know. I suspect, I'm not convinced that Xi Jinping is a new Mao. I know that Xi Jinping thought he's been promoted. I know that there is being something of a personality cult created around him. I think he's thinker enough to understand the mechanics of power in China. I don't know that he yet has anything like Mao's paranoia. I just have this impression that he's someone who thinks things through thoroughly, sort of goes through, yes, you know, we could do all that, yeah, and that would be really handy on a status point of view. He looks back to classical Chinese history. He likes presenting himself as traditional Chinese as well as a revolutionary. There's a sort of sanity there that you find less and less as Mao gets older, and certainly as the personality cult grew. Mao was showing all signs of megalomania. He was never a particularly nice person, but he was certainly getting towards the paranoid by the end of the 60s. So, and even after, I think the shock of people disagreeing with him after the Great Leap Forward seems to have turned Mao. And I don't think Xi Jinping is yet a power freak, a control freak, yes, but not a power freak. Not yet, I don't think, a power freak. But as I said, we do have that saying in the West, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So whether he will eventually turn into another Mao, I couldn't tell you.
Thanks, Wendy. Anybody else got a question or a comment?
Just thank you very much.
Yeah, excellent. All right.
Yeah. Look, you're all very welcome. I would certainly like to see Australians knowing more about China. I do think we need to be educating our kids so that they are at least talking about China from an informed viewpoint. I think the price of ignorance is little fiascos like this last one, where Marisa Payne was basically talking to China like the headmistress. You know, we're going to find you out and you suffer for this. And you thought, oh, really? That can be couched in respectful ways. And when you want China's cooperation, what Marisa Payne and company had to say, it was the manner of their speech and the timing. There's a new book that has just been released on China, which has been enormously confidence restoring. It's been released by a professor called Mahbubani, who works in Singapore, where some very fine China scholars operate. And he's come out, and the message he's putting through is pretty much the kind of message that I'm giving to you. If you look up the book is called Has China Won? And it's in the bookshops currently.
Wendy, the first question continued. Which regions dominate the Politburo?
Which regions? Look, I don't have a detailed enough knowledge, I think, to tell you that. It's chosen from all over China, but Xi Jinping, you know, again, it's a political decision. It's one that happens within the Communist Party. Xi Jinping comes from provincial experience, but his background is Beijing.
And Sue has a question, I think. Sue, do you want to speak that? Because it's very...
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. My typing's appalling, and so, of course, my spelling is appalling. At UWA, I attended a lecture where there were 3 eminent Chinese agricultural scientists. It was put on by the Department of Agriculture at UWA, who do a lot of outreach in China and elsewhere in Asia. And they said that the Chinese leadership will never, ever allow the Chinese people to go hungry again because of the destabilization of their country that results from this, and that they will always do everything they can to ensure a good food supply. And yet I heard another very eminent Chinese scientist talk about the big problems they have in China with both soil compaction, overuse of fertilizers, and very, very limited quality water, and the table's basically disappearing in the north, and they're considering pumping water from the south thousands of kilometres to the north. They do irrigated wheat growing and all sorts of things up there. So this is something which I think Australians are a bit concerned about, is the purchase, and I know in WA there's been large purchases of agricultural land for growing wheat particularly. They own a big port facility in Esperance where they export it straight to China. Is this something Australia or other parts of the world should be concerned about, or is it possible that we could have a far better collaborative arrangement with the Chinese? I mean,
I think this is something that we have to work on. We do, I mean, I'm not denying for a minute that Australia needs to think very hard about what they are prepared to allow China to do. As a young man I was talking to a couple of weeks ago was saying, you know, Australia needs to keep its eye on foreign ownership generally. And I think he pointed out Canadians actually own more Australian.
Canadians and the English the most, Canadians after that, yes.
Yes, yes. So here we are. But yes, I mean, we do need to be concerned about that. And we also need to be concerned about those other issues. I have to say, and I think of the great powers, the only one at the moment that actually has an effective government is China. Now, one of China's key problems is pollution of every kind.
Yeah.
China is the one country in the world which can make a visible difference in a very limited time span. I suggested you watch 2 TED Talks. One of those was Angela Hsu, who's talking about wind power. Now, this is not because I was particularly interested in wind power. It is just that she gives an example of the speed with which China can act on a very large scale. My nightmare is that we will allow climate change to come to the point where climate engineering is attempted, and China, if it goes, it is likely to be very much at the cutting edge of that, and China will act in China's interests at whatever price to China's neighbours or whoever. So yes, I think what you're saying is drawing our attention to the things that we need to think about. Mahbubani's book, Has China Won, is about living in a new world power structure, and we need to think very hard about where we fit in with that. We have got to stop this China is the antagonist way of thinking. American historians are very heavily into discussing whether war with China is inevitable. It's interesting the degree to which the Americans do think in militaristic terms.
Mm.
And we need to think where we belong in that scene. Mahbubani describes us as as a friend of Australia, he describes us as clinging pathetically to the tail of the tiger. And he is pretty right, and it is time. We don't have to declare antagonism to the United States, but we do have to work out our own place and our own attitudes, because China is a reality. Mahbubani and others are saying it's not going to go away, and I think that's pretty clear. Yes, I would absolutely concur with what you're saying. So.
Thanks, Wendy. Has anybody else got any questions or comments? Nope.
Yeah, a superb presentation, Wendy. Thanks very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry I missed your first one, but I'll catch up on the recording.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very satisfying thing to do, and I hope you'll feel curious enough to go on chasing it up and to read. And we will all be waiting on the next instalment of Xi Jinping.
Thanks very much, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy.
Very welcome. So